Do you believe a single act of compassion could change the fate of an entire species? In 1989, deep in the cold forests of Washington, a young man named Porter Hale stumbled upon something no one was ever supposed to see. Bigfoot, injured, massive, and very real. But instead of fear, Porter chose empathy. He bandaged the wound. He left food and water, and in return, the creature began to respond, with pebbles shaped into arrows, gifts left silently, and a language beyond words. This isn't a fantasy. It's a true story pulled from Porter's personal journals, written by a man who spent over 30 years living alone in the wild, changed forever by that meeting. In this video, you'll discover how Bigfoot learned to communicate, why Porter risked his life to protect them, and what silent lessons remained long after the footprints disappeared. Because when Porter bled to destroy a hunter's trap, the only thing left behind was a stone, etched with the image of a man and a giant. If you've ever believed in kindness, watch until the end. Because sometimes the quietest moments carry the loudest promises. The morning fog hadn't yet burned off the edges of Medalline Falls when Porter Hale zipped his flannel over his chest, stepped into his worn boots, and unlatched the door of his one-room forest cabin. The hinges creaked with the same tiredness that lived in his bones, but the air outside was sharp, clean, laced with the scent of pine, damp bark, and the beginning of autumn. Leaves rustled overhead, deep red and maple gold, already loosening from their branches as the first week of September crept in. He stood there a moment, still as the timbers around him, and listened. The forest didn't sing much anymore. Not since the fire to the west. Not since the logging trucks carved through those quiet places with their diesel roars and steel mouths. He tugged the brim of his cap low, adjusted the canvas strap of his canteen over his shoulder, and started down the familiar trail. It was maintenance day. Trail 17A, up near Sullivan Creek, past the second bridge where the boardwalk rotted out last spring. His job was to mark, clear, record, report fallen trees, keep the path visible. That's what the Colville Forest maintenance contract said. Keep it visible, keep it clean. He did it alone, 5 days a week. Sometimes 6, if the rains had been bad or the hunters had been reckless. Porter didn't mind the solitude. He'd grown into it the way moss grows on stone. Slow, steady, no ceremony. He didn't own a truck, just a bike and his legs. Groceries came from town once a week, if that. Gas lantern, wood stove, no phone, no noise. It was easier that way. Cleaner. His mother used to say, "The more people around, the harder it is to hear yourself think." She died of lung cancer when he was 15. The silence after that was too loud to ignore. His father? Gone even before that. Disappeared somewhere between Spokane and Montana, leaving behind a pocket knife and a shoebox full of debt. Porter walked with measured steps, the morning chill licking at his fingers. The deeper he moved into the maple forest, the more the air seemed to thicken. Not with heat or humidity, but with something older, something watching. He wouldn't have said that aloud, but he felt it in the way the jays didn't call, in the hush beneath the canopy, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Still, he pressed on, crunching over a carpet of pine needles and broken twigs, marking spots with his blaze-orange tape. It was around mile 2 that the sound stopped him. Low, long, not human, not wind. It rose like something pulled from the belly of the earth, raw and groaning. It wasn't a bear's growl, not even a cougar's scream. It was deeper, slower. A tremor beneath the ribs kind of sound, vibrating through the soles of his boots and into the marrow of his bones. It came from the northwest slope, deep past the drainage line Porter usually avoided. That part of the woods was steep, torn by rock slides, thick with fallen timber and blackened stumps from the old fire. He paused mid-step, heart ticking faster, and scanned the trees. Silence again, then another sound. Not the same as before. This one, briefer, rougher, like a breath trapped inside a throat. It faded as quickly as it came. Porter stood there, hand on the trunk of a red maple, and thought about turning back. No one would blame him. He wasn't law enforcement. He wasn't armed. He had no radio, no backup. But then he heard her voice. Not real. Not in his ears. But in memory. The way she'd said it when they found that fox with the broken leg behind their trailer when he was 10. No creature deserves to suffer alone. His grip tightened. He took a breath, then another, and stepped off trail. The underbrush was thick, clawing at his pants and boots. Branches snapped back into his face. Brambles caught at his flannel. He followed the direction of the sound, compass in hand, pushing deeper into the slope. Birds scattered once, maybe twice, but otherwise the forest kept still. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and then, at the bottom of a ravine shaded by leaning alders, he saw it. At first, he thought it was a bear, collapsed beneath a blanket of leaves and dirt. But then it shifted, slow, deliberate, and the light caught the curve of a shoulder, a rise of thick black fur, matted and wet. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything he'd seen in 23 years of living on the edge of the wild. The figure was massive, 8 feet, maybe more, hunched. One leg twisted at an angle that wasn't right. The fur shimmered dark brown and coal black in the morning light. Its chest rose and fell, shallow, strained, and its eyes, deep-set, human-like, full of pain, met his. Porter didn't move, couldn't. Every nerve screamed to run. His chest locked, his breath turned to glass. But the eyes didn't blink. They didn't threaten. They just watched him, as if waiting. He dropped to one knee, slowly, carefully, hands raised in open air. The creature didn't flinch, didn't bare teeth. Its gaze only flicked once, down to its leg, then back to him. Porter unzipped his jacket pocket and pulled out a red bandana. Torn, old, but clean. He moved closer, inch by inch, until he could see the bone under the skin. A compound fracture, badly swollen, likely days old. He didn't speak, just wrapped the bandana tight above the break to slow swelling, then reached for the strap of his canteen. The creature watched him drink, then turned its head away. Not with shame, but as if it knew this kindness wasn't permanent. Porter left the bandana, his half-full water bottle, and an energy bar on the moss beside it. Then backed away, hands still raised, heart pounding so loud it nearly drowned the sound of his boots in the brush. Back at the cabin, the sun had already risen high enough to warm the tin roof. He threw open his supply bin, grabbed gauze, iodine, more water, the last 2 energy bars, and his mother's old camp knife, just in case. 20 minutes later, he was back at the ravine, but it was gone. The leaves were disturbed, the moss pressed down, but the creature had vanished. He crouched where it had been, pressed his fingers to the damp ground. Nothing but a few strands of hair, long, coarse, black, still warm. He sat on a fallen log nearby, unsure what to feel. Relief? Disappointment? Fear? Then he saw it, balanced perfectly on the center of the log where he'd left his supplies. His empty water bottle, the wrapper of the energy bar folded with eerie precision into a perfect triangle. And beside them, a small arrow made of white river pebbles, pointing due north. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a game. It was language. He stared at it for a long while. The arrow, the folded wrapper, the silence. The leaves whispered above him, caught in a breeze that hadn't been there a moment ago. And for the first time since he was a boy, Porter felt the distinct shift of something sacred stepping into his world. Not loud, not violent, just present. Like a door opening in the dark. He picked up the bandana, still stained with blood, then stood slowly. The arrow waited, unmoving, patient, and something in him answered it, not with words, but with footsteps, toward the north, and whatever waited there, somewhere between the wind and the trees. The forest closed behind him, one breath quieter than before. The air had thickened since yesterday, not in temperature but in weight, like the trees had heard what he'd heard and were now holding something secret between them. Porter moved with more care than usual that morning, his boots brushing aside the maple leaves that blanketed the path like pieces of old flame. There was no trail anymore, not the kind that made sense on any map. Just that arrow made of stones, still fixed in his memory, pointing north like it had something to say he wasn't ready to understand. But he followed it anyway, deeper into the hills, through shadows that clung a little longer to the trunks. Somewhere ahead, something had been left behind. Something massive, something broken. He hadn't told anyone. Not the ranger station, not the old man at the supply shack. Not Lorraine at the Mill Corner diner when she asked if he was sleeping okay. He just nodded and said the river had been loud lately. Let it go at that. Because what would he say? That something bigger than any animal he'd ever seen had looked him in the eye and let him live? That it waited, watched, then disappeared without sound? That it folded a food wrapper and pointed him toward a part of the forest no one in town talked about unless they were drunk? He hadn't slept. Not really. Not since the sound, not since the eyes. Now the wind moved without sound, brushing the red-gold canopy above him like someone sweeping a ceiling with invisible fingers. He stepped around a fallen log, ducked beneath a rotting branch, and paused when he saw it again. A mark in the moss. A depression too clean, too deep. A heel, and another. Spaced wide, like whoever made them didn't walk, but strode. Whatever left those tracks had weight. More than a man, much more. He exhaled and pressed forward. No birds, no squirrels, no rustle of rabbit in the brush. Just the steady rhythm of his own breath and the growing hum in his chest, like a warning that hadn't found its words yet. The trees parted a little ahead, a splash of yellow maple catching late morning light. And there, against the base of a sloping ridge, he saw movement. Slow. Almost like the rock itself had exhaled. Porter stopped. His foot froze mid-step. There it was again, not lying this time. Sitting, slumped. One leg stretched unnaturally, twisted at the joint. The creature's back rested against a split boulder, its breath shallow, its face half hidden behind matted fur and dried blood. Flies buzzed faintly near the wound, but it didn't swat them away. One arm hung low, thick as a fence post, knuckles resting in the leaves. It looked at him, not like an animal sizing up prey, not like a man begging help, just looking, like it remembered him. Porter's throat tightened. He could run, he could turn back, pretend he saw nothing, but his feet didn't move. His mother's voice echoed again, not as memory this time, but as presence. Right there, in the rustle of the leaves. Don't let anything die alone. He stepped forward slowly, carefully. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his hands. He just knelt, like he was approaching something sacred. The creature didn't flinch. Up close, the damage was clearer. The leg had swollen with dark bruising, bone nearly pushing through the skin. The foot twisted inward, motionless. Its fur was thick, dark like wet soil, threaded with debris and blood. The eyes still remained steady, intelligent, not like a deer's panic or a bear's suspicion. Something else, something that knew what pain was. Porter pulled off his outer shirt, the buttons catching on his cuff, and tore it in half with his teeth. He worked fast, folding the cloth into a crude splint. The creature exhaled once, low and long, not in protest, but almost like it understood. As if the gesture mattered more than the fix. He didn't speak, just wrapped, bound. Tighten the knot. The creature tensed once, but didn't strike. Porter sat back, breathing hard, and pulled out the thermos from his side bag. He unscrewed it, tilted it slightly toward the creature, waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a hand moved, huge, black-furred, 5 fingers, palm wide and flat. It didn't take the thermos but touched the edge of it, held it steady, drank. One long gulp. Then set it down, careful not to spill. Porter blinked. His hands were shaking. He placed the last energy bar from his bag on a flat stone, stood up, and backed away. The creature watched, but didn't move. Not a muscle. Porter turned once at the edge of the trees before vanishing back into the forest. Back at the cabin, he worked fast. Refilled the thermos, packed gauze, a needle and thread, though he doubted he could use it. He thought of bringing a blanket but stopped himself. Too much. Too soon. He stepped out just before dusk and made his way back. Half running, the trail now burned into his memory. He arrived as the last light dropped behind the hills. But it was gone again. He dropped to one knee, scanned the area. The blood was still there. The bandage he'd tied lay near the boulder, untied but not torn, just set down like a thank you note. And on the stone where he'd placed the energy bar, the wrapper was gone. In its place, 3 stones, smooth river rocks, stacked perfectly on top of one another. And beside them, another arrow, north again. But this one was different. More urgent, the angle sharper. The stones pressed deeper into the soil, as if laid by a hand, trembling or rushing. He stood in silence. The forest didn't move. Then, at the base of a tree, he spotted something else. His thermos. Empty, cleaned, capped, placed with care. Porter reached down, fingers brushing the cool metal, and something shifted inside him. A quiet understanding. Not spoken, not clear, but real. The creature had moved. Not far, but enough. Still alive. Still watching. And something about that, about being seen and not feared, lodged itself deep in his ribs. He tucked the thermos under his arm and turned toward home, following the new direction without hesitation. That night, he slept. Not deeply, but better. The wind returned. So did the silence. But it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something listening, something breathing with him. Somewhere out there, among the glowing leaves and broken stones, a connection had been made. Not with words, not with names, but with pain, with trust, with the simple act of not walking away. And when he opened the cabin door just before dawn, stepping into the chill with bare arms and clear eyes, he knew the forest had changed. Not the trees, not the paths, but the way it watched him back. Something sacred had been broken and rebuilt. One step, one silence, one arrow at a time. He hadn't planned for it to become a habit. It started with one visit, just to be sure the creature hadn't died under that ridge of maple and alder. But then came the second, and the third. Porter found himself waking earlier, moving quieter, packing water and small meals like it was part of his job. Each time, he followed the stone arrows, always freshly laid, never in the same formation twice, always pointing just far enough to make him wonder who else might be watching the trees behind him. Sometimes the stones were stacked in threes, sometimes flat. Once, he found them arranged in a gentle arc, with a smooth pine cone in the center. It didn't feel random. It felt intentional, like punctuation left in moss. The air had turned colder in the last few days. Not full winter yet, but enough to sting the lungs at sunrise. The maples were almost bare now, their colors drained to pale rust and bone. The birches clattered softly in the wind. The forest had shifted again, not with fear this time, but with something quieter, like it had grown used to his footsteps, expected them. He never saw the creature, not since that second time near the ridge, but he knew it was still there. He saw the signs, tracks pressed into wet leaves, small tufts of dark fur caught on split branches. Clean bones of a deer laid carefully beside a stump, picked dry and left without mess. It moved differently now, no longer dragging its leg, but leaning into a long staff. A branch, maybe, sharpened by hand or claw. Its bark stripped clean in spirals like someone had whittled it with focus. On the 7th visit, Porter left a thermos of hot tea beside a dead log and sat nearby in the shadow of a leaning fir. He didn't say a word, just waited. Watched the steam curl upward, disappear into the cold. When he returned the next morning, the thermos was gone. A pine cone, hollowed at the top, sat in its place, filled with charred cedar needles and ash. A message, or a thank you, or something else entirely. But it meant something. That night, the wind howled harder than it had in weeks. The cabin creaked in protest. Porter lay in bed with the lantern off, staring at the ceiling boards, thinking about those eyes, the steady breath, the way pain and silence had lived between them like two old neighbors. He drifted into sleep just after midnight, the kind that never settles fully, and woke to a sound that didn't belong. Heavy, measured, walking, not on gravel, not boots. Something softer. Weight spread across pads. He sat up fast, heart racing, listening. No birds, no wind. Just the occasional groan of wood, as if the frame of the cabin was holding its breath. Then a thud. Distant. Maybe 10 feet from the front step. Then stillness again. He didn't reach for the lantern. Didn't touch the door. Just sat in the dark, eyes wide, chest rising slow. Another step. He pictured it out there, circling, not lost, not threatening, just present. Like it had come to confirm something, to check if the silence between them still held. He stayed frozen in bed until the first hint of gray touched the frost-flecked windows. When he finally stepped outside, breath misting, boots crunching the frost-bitten leaves, there were no tracks. Just the thinnest layer of fog curling around the tree trunks like something shy. And on the cabin's wooden step, placed dead center without haste or carelessness, sat a flat stone, river smoothed, cold to the touch. Its surface had been scorched lightly with fire or charcoal. 2 stick figures etched in thick, crude lines, one tall, one small. No words, no marks. Just the 2 shapes, side by side. Porter stared at it for a long time, kneeling slowly, tracing the marks with the edge of his finger. The taller figure had broader shoulders. The smaller one stood close, almost touching. Not stick figures like children draw, but symbols. A kind of declaration. A mirror, maybe. His chest felt tight, not from fear, not even from surprise, but from something deeper. He stood and stepped back, scanning the tree line, the clearing, the hills behind. Nothing moved, but the silence felt warmer now, like a door had opened, not wide, but enough. Enough to say, I see you. Enough to say, I remember. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the trees took on that last fleeting golden hue, he returned to the same spot with a fresh bandana and 2 small tins of smoked fish. He didn't know if the creature liked fish. Didn't know what it ate exactly, but it felt right. He laid the tins side by side on the same stump where the arrow stones had first pointed him. Then, beside them, he placed something else, a piece of charcoal, and under it, a folded page from an old field journal. No writing, just a blank space, like an invitation. When he walked away, he didn't look back. That night, the wind didn't howl. It whispered, like something brushing against the doorframe, like a thought trying to find shape. Around 3 a.m., the old lantern on his table flickered on its own, not violently, just enough to rattle its glass. Porter stirred but didn't rise. Something in him knew. Morning came gray and brittle. He stepped outside, boots crunching frost, hands tucked deep in his flannel pockets. On the stump where he'd left the food, only the tins remained, emptied, Lids closed neatly, no teeth marks, no mess. The charcoal was gone, and on the blank page, a single line had been drawn with burnt ash, angled gently, sloping upward, intersected at one point by a second mark. A symbol, a direction, maybe even a path. Porter stood there in the chill, air sharp in his lungs, eyes locked on that page like it held more than ink. And deep in the trees, something unseen waited, not hidden out of fear, but out of respect. The space between them wasn't absence. It was a promise, a careful watching, a shared breath stretched across the maples, and though nothing stirred, he felt it again. That unseen gaze, that hush in the canopy, that sense that he was no longer alone out here. Not really. The nights ahead would grow colder, the trail frost slick, the silence deeper. But now, when the wind scraped against the cabin and the shadows moved just past the edge of the porch light, Porter wouldn't flinch, because now he knew. Some silences speak louder than words. Some eyes leave a mark deeper than scars. And some forest paths, especially the ones that begin with stone arrows and end with charcoal drawings, aren't meant to be walked alone. Not anymore. The first frost held longer that morning. It clung to the porch rails, the corners of windows. The cedar needles curled on the cabin's roof. The sky was clear, but the chill hadn't broken even after sunrise. Porter stood outside in a thermal shirt too thin for the season, breath curling from his mouth as he stared into the woods like someone waiting for a verdict. The silence didn't bother him anymore. It had grown into something different, less of an absence, more of a presence stretched thin between trees and shadows. Something watching, but never pressing. He picked up his pack from the porch floor, slung it over his shoulder, and stepped off the worn planks. The boards creaked behind him, and he paused for a heartbeat, hand on the railing, as if expecting to hear an echo of steps that weren't his. None came, just the hush of branches overhead, and a faint caw of a crow flying west toward the ridgeline. The woods had begun giving back in ways he couldn't explain. It started 2 mornings ago, when he found the deer meat. Fresh. Skinned with precision, no sign of tooth or claw. Laid carefully on a stone slab just past the second bend of his trail. No blood, no mess. Just a clean gift, like something left in offering. He didn't take it the first day, didn't dare. Just crouched beside it and stared until his legs ached. The next morning, it was gone. But in its place, a line of river stones leading toward the eastern bluff, each one spaced evenly, like footsteps. He'd followed them halfway up the slope, then stopped when he found the second gift. His old compass, the one he'd dropped weeks ago crossing the ravine near the broken bridge. But it wasn't how he'd left it. The face had been carefully popped open, the rusted needle replaced with a sliver of polished wood. Carved down to a sharp point, set perfectly in the center, fixed toward the north. Not functioning, not repaired, just pointed, like a message, not a tool. He hadn't touched it, not at first, just knelt in the frost and stared at it, lips parted, breath shallow. Because it wasn't the compass itself, it was what it meant. A memory handed back to him, altered, as if someone out there had been trying to say, "I saw what you lost. I thought you might need it still." He'd taken it with both hands, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it in the wooden box beneath his bed that used to hold his mother's rosary and the old photos from when they lived near Cheney. That morning, he wasn't following stones. There were none laid out today. No lines, no pine cones. Just a feeling in his gut that tugged toward the river, down past the burnt grove where the fire years ago had blackened the trunks but spared the roots. The sky above was open there, a soft pale blue bleeding into amber at the edges. He moved without noise, boots brushing leaves aside like a ghost had passed before him. When he reached the edge of the bluff, he stopped, Below, the Pend Oreille shimmered with slow currents, breaking gently around ice-balled rocks. The banks were crusted in frost, the reeds stiff and silvered. And near the edge, where the slope flattened into a hollow carved by time and water, sat something he hadn't expected. A second offering, this one different. A semicircle of river rocks, maybe a dozen of them, arranged like a crescent moon. In the center, resting perfectly balanced, was the compass again. Open, the wooden needle now gone. In its place, a cedar twig, stripped bare, shaped to the same angle. He dropped to one knee without thinking. His throat tightened, his fingers hovered over it, not to take, just to feel the air above it. The cold bit through his gloves. The rocks were smooth, wet from morning dew, but not muddy. No other prints around. Not animal, not human, but they had been here. Recently, watching him. He hadn't realized how hard he was breathing until he exhaled and saw the plume rise up in front of his face. It didn't fade quickly. The air felt thicker today. He stood and stepped back, almost reverently, then sat on the large stump near the pine with the half-split bark. He pulled the compass close and held it with both hands, elbows on his knees. His fingers trembled, but not from cold. There was something about the shape of it, the deliberate angle, the reused symbol, that cracked open a part of him he hadn't meant to touch. He remembered being 7 years old, sitting in the back of a truck while his father drove silent down an empty county road. The boy in him had watched the shadows of trees move across the dashboard, trying to guess where they were going. He never asked, just held the compass then too, and hoped it would lead him somewhere better. Now, decades later, he was holding that same shape again. Different, altered, but the memory still burned beneath his ribs. He whispered without knowing why, "I won't break this, not what we're building." His voice didn't echo. The woods absorbed it gently. He looked toward the tree line again, saw nothing but shadow, but he knew they heard, whatever they meant. That afternoon, before returning home, he passed through the outskirts of town, not to resupply, just to feel human again for a minute. The din of tires on pavement, the faint jingle of the diner's doorbell, the smell of grease and coffee. It hit him like another world. Lorraine Pike spotted him before he even sat down, her gray apron smeared with flour, her hands drying on a dish towel. She gave a small nod, as if reading something in his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said gently. He didn't smile, just pulled off his gloves and sat at the end booth, the one closest to the window. She poured his coffee without asking. He wrapped his hands around the mug like he needed the weight of it to stay tethered. "Been walking the woods again?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah." He still chasing broken trees and bad trail markers? He looked out the window, where the wind bent the roadside grass low. "Not this time." Lorraine didn't press, just refilled his cup and brought over a slice of apple pie without charging. Sat across from him without speaking. After a while, she placed her hand lightly on his wrist. "Whatever it is," she said, "don't let it take you away from the good parts of yourself. You've got more to give than just silence." He couldn't answer. Not then, but something in her words sank deeper than she knew. When he returned to the cabin that night, the wind had died down. The sky held stars behind thin cloud ribbons. The compass sat on his nightstand, its cedar needle glowing faint in the lamplight. He traced its edge with one finger. Then, without thinking, he opened the journal by his bed. A blank page waited. At the top, he drew a single line. North. Not for direction, not for memory, for trust, for whatever this was becoming. Outside, the trees creaked gently in the night breeze, and something in the forest breathed with him, as if to say, "I saw you keep your word." And he would, even if it meant losing his bearings again, even if it meant the only map left was made of stone, ash, and silence, under the crescent moon. The woods pressed closer, and the cold came with a sharper edge. It was the kind of night that made the wind feel like it had teeth, slipping through the seams of jackets and clawing at bare skin with invisible fingers. Porter moved slower now, flashlight in hand but pointed low, keeping its beam tight to the ground. He didn't like using it out here. Light had a way of announcing you louder than footsteps ever could. But tonight, something had shifted. Something wasn't sitting right in the bones of the forest. He'd first heard the rumors over coffee at the diner, spoken low between mouthfuls of biscuits and sausage gravy, by two locals with more grease under their nails than patience in their voices. They weren't talking to him. They never really did. But he was close enough to hear. Something about a creature. Something wounded. Tracks that didn't belong to elk or man. Porter sat still and kept his eyes on his coffee, but the words curled under his skin like smoke under a door. Later, he heard their names. Deke Laramie and Boyd Tanner. Poachers, both of them. Men who treated the woods like a convenience store shelf. Grab what you want, break what you don't need. They had no reverence for silence, no understanding of boundary. Just greed masked as sport. Porter didn't sleep that night. He sat at the edge of his cot, hands clasped between his knees. The lantern turned low. He stared at the wood grain on the floor until the shadows moved on their own. He could feel it, like a thread pulled taut between him and something deeper out there. Something watching. Something too quiet for comfort. The next evening, just after dusk, he followed the ridge trail west, past the old switchbacks where the maple roots clawed like fingers through the soil. There'd been no new stones, no offerings, just silence. Even the birds had pulled back, like the whole forest was bracing. Then he saw them, eyes, 3 pairs, low to the ground, glowing yellow in the thin beam of his flashlight. Too low for deer, too synchronized for wolves. They didn't blink, they didn't flinch. They moved like breath, together, slow, quiet, calculated. Not afraid of him, not curious either, focused. The beam shifted, caught them just long enough for his heart to stutter. Small bodies, covered in fur. Not bear cubs, not anything he could name. But they weren't alone. Something rumbled farther out. A sound too big to be near and too near to ignore. Deep, guttural. Not quite a growl. More like a warning echo rolling through the trunks. The 3 figures froze, then turned as one, slipping back into the trees so fast it felt like watching smoke vanish, in reverse. Porter stood there a long moment, lips parted, the flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. The sound came again. This time from the north, lower, longer. It held weight, like someone sounding an alarm that didn't use sirens. He turned slowly, heart pounding against his ribs like a drum too tightly strung. That's when he saw the wire, barely visible, knee-high, strung between 2 trees with sharp steel hooks at the center. He dropped the light and reached down fast, hands working to untangle the wire. His thumb caught a barb. Blood welled up quick. He didn't care. He unraveled it, shoved it into his bag, wiped his hand on the leg of his jeans, and scanned the ground for more. There were others. At least 2 more traps nearby. One half hidden under leaves, one right out in the open like bait for something bigger. They'd set a perimeter. He backed out slowly, the wind pressing at his ears now, full of whispers too soft to understand. He didn't speak, didn't curse, just moved, careful and fast, retracing his steps. He didn't stop until the cabin came into view, the windows dark, the world outside painted in pale gray and black. Inside, he cleaned the cut and wrapped it tight, fingers trembling more than he wanted to admit. His head throbbed, not from the wound, from the knowing. They'd come too close. They'd seen the young, and someone out there had warned him. He left the lantern off that night. Instead, he sat near the window, wrapped in a blanket, eyes fixed on the line where trees became shadows. The forest didn't sleep. Neither did he. By first light, the world looked unchanged. Frost on the steps, the same stubborn jays calling from the high branches. But something on the porch made him stop. Right there, set gently against the wood grain, was a new stone arrow. Smaller than before, but sharper. Pointed not just north, but slightly east. It wasn't laid with care like the others. It was scattered, uneven, like someone made it quickly. In warning, he stepped off the porch and followed it. The pain in his thumb pulsing under the bandage like a heartbeat, reminding him he was still tethered to something living. The trail led him farther than usual. Past the old timber grove, down into the marsh flats where the ground sucked at your boots with each step. It was there, beside a moss-covered boulder, that he found the last sign, a shape drawn in ash on the rock's face. A circle, split down the center, one half darkened, one side left raw. He stood there, breath visible in the morning air, the sound of his own pulse thudding in his ears. He didn't know what it meant, but he understood enough. There were lines you didn't cross. There were debts you didn't let others pay alone. That night, as the frost thickened and the moon bled pale over the tree line, Porter set out again. Not with offerings, not with hope of seeing them, but with a plan. He doubled back to the slope where the traps had been, cleared every wire he could find, tossed them into the ravine. Then he laid his own kind of path, one made from deer scent, dragged across the trail to pull attention eastward, then deeper, into dead ground. No cover, no high trees, just flat, open silence. A false track, a distraction. He scattered clumps of fur, dragged a boot heel like it had been wounded, marked a trail only a desperate poacher would follow. When he returned to the cabin, it was nearly dawn. His hands ached, his lungs burned. But he knew the signs would be read, maybe not by those who set the traps, but by the ones who understood more than words. He slept hard, dreamless, woke with sunlight slanting through the dusty windows and the sound of nothing outside. No birds, no branches creaking, just stillness. When he stepped onto the porch, the air was different again, cleaner somehow. And there on the railing, placed carefully this time, was a small stone, smooth, warm from sun. Next to it, a line of bark peeled in half, tied gently with a strand of grass. It looked like a bandage, a nod to what had been done, a gesture that didn't need translation. He picked it up slowly, held it in his palm like something fragile, and stared into the woods that gave no answers. His thumb throbbed faintly under the wrap. He let it hurt, because some wounds meant something, some silence meant gratitude. And some nights, even with a moon that cut like a blade, you found yourself standing on the porch of an old wooden cabin, holding proof that trust, even the kind whispered between trees, can take root in the dark, and maybe, just maybe, survive. Under a pale sky the color of old steel, the woods stood still as if listening. The cold had sharpened again, creeping into the seams of windows, under the cracks of doors, turning every breath into glass. Porter stood on the porch, arms crossed tight against his chest, the weight of silence heavier than usual. It wasn't the stillness of waiting anymore. It was the stillness of farewell. On the first step, half in shadow, lay a single arrow made of stone, its tip snapped clean in two. It hadn't been scattered. It hadn't been broken by accident. The placement was deliberate, a message written in silence. He crouched slowly, picking it up with both hands like it might disappear if handled too quickly. The break line was smooth, unnaturally so, as if it had been cracked against another stone with purpose. He stared at it for a long time, longer than he meant to, the wind lifting his collar as if tugging him back inside. But the meaning was clear. The road that had led him this far, the trail of symbols, of trust, of quiet communion, had come to an end. Not in betrayal, not in fear, just necessity. There was a boundary here, and it had closed. That night, he didn't light the lantern. He moved around the cabin in half darkness, making tea he didn't drink and watching the trees lean in closer through the window like they, too, felt the weight of something ending. But sleep didn't come. Around midnight, the dogs barked at a nearby camp downriver. Too sharp, too short, not playful. He stepped out to the porch, boots crunching frost, and scanned the trees again. Nothing. No shadows, no glowing eyes. Just a different kind of quiet. One made from waiting. The next morning he found the first set of boot prints. Fresh, deep. Not his, not hikers. Worn soles, heavy heel drag. He followed them a few yards until they turned toward the east trail, where no markers were laid, no paths carved, where the forest thickened into something ancient. He doubled back, chest tight, fingers twitching toward the hatchet at his side. Not out of fear, out of instinct, because something was wrong now, and it wasn't the kind of wrong the trees could fix. He saw the broken branches before he saw the trap. Thin wire, taut between two saplings, the kind used for snaring legs. Fresh bait staked near the center, but no blood. Not yet. He knelt and cut it clean, eyes darting over the brush. He found 2 more that morning, both disarmed, both crude, but deadly enough. Someone had come back, and this time they weren't guessing. They were hunting, not for deer, not for elk, something else. By mid-afternoon, Porter had circled the perimeter of the western slope, following faint signs, broken twigs, disturbed moss, the faint stink of cigarettes ground into bark. The sun dipped early that time of year, leaving long slashes of light between the trees and turning every shadow into something worth checking twice. On his way home, just past the creek bend near the old cedar split by lightning, he saw a new shape in the frost. Small, human, not a poacher, not a footprint that belonged out here. The tread was narrow, light, running, too fast, too sudden. He followed without thinking, instinct dragging him forward. Then he heard it, a thin cry, broken by wind. Not loud, not sustained, just sharp enough to stop his blood. He ran. Branches slapped his arms. Ice cracked beneath his boots. The trees opened up into a slope, steep and slick with half-melted snow. Down below, a figure teetered at the edge of a low embankment, half dirt, half stone, where the runoff from the spring floods had gouged the land clean. A girl. No more than 12. Her arms flailed for balance, one booted foot half off the edge. He shouted before thinking, "Don't move! Hold still!" She turned, startled, and slipped. Her scream vanished into the air. Porter dropped his pack and slid fast, half falling, fingers digging into mud, reaching as she tumbled toward the drop. He lunged and caught her wrist just as her feet left the ground. The jolt yanked his shoulder out of place with a pop that made stars explode behind his eyes, but he didn't let go. Her boot kicked into his ribs, but he dug his heels in, leaned back, pulled hard. She came up coughing, mud streaked down her face, hair plastered to her cheek. He gripped her tight until they both collapsed onto the moss, breathless, shaking. It took a while before either of them spoke. Finally, she looked up, eyes wide with fear and something deeper, shock maybe. "I didn't mean to go that far. I thought I saw something moving." Her voice cracked at the edges. Like a person, but bigger. He didn't answer, just nodded slowly, heart still thudding in his chest. He helped her stand, brushed the pine needles from her jacket, and checked her ankles. No breaks, just bruises. "You out here alone?" he asked. She looked down. "My uncle's setting up camp by the road. Said I could walk a little while." Her breath fogged in the cold. "I thought I knew the way." Porter sighed and glanced up at the ridge. The sky had gone slate gray, promising another freeze. He looked back down the slope, back toward the broken ground where she would have vanished. And beyond that, the deep woods. He had a strange thought then, stranger than most he'd had lately. What would have happened if he hadn't found her? Who else might have? The creature had been quiet lately. No signs, no stones. But the woods still held something, a shape, a presence, watching, guiding. He couldn't explain it, but he felt it as real as frost on his gloves. He walked her back to the main road, made sure she found her uncle's van, exchanged quiet nods with the man who looked too busy with his cooler to ask real questions. Then he turned back to the trees, back to the silence. That night there was no wind, but the forest wasn't still. He heard movement, heavy, deliberate, circling the cabin but not approaching. He didn't rise, just sat by the fire, shoulder aching, thumb still wrapped tight from the trap incident days ago. In the morning, he opened the door and found nothing on the porch, nothing on the step. But down in the frost, maybe 5 feet from the base of the stair, lay a smooth stone, flat and gray. And across it, a deep line had been carved, straight through, a line that didn't mark direction. It marked finality, a warning, or a boundary. He didn't know which anymore. He didn't move it, didn't take it inside, just stared at it and nodded once. Because some doors didn't close with sound. Some goodbyes didn't need language. And sometimes the most human thing you could do was step back, say nothing, and trust that the silence meant the same to them as it did to you. That afternoon, he sat on the porch and stared toward the tree line, coffee cooling in his hand, shoulders still stiff, ribs still sore. He thought about the girl, the fear in her voice, the invisible hand that had seemed to nudge her just enough into his path. And he thought about the thing he'd felt while pulling her back, the memory, not of strength, but of balance, of something he'd seen before, a way of standing in a place that doesn't want you to fall, a movement borrowed from something older, bigger, quieter. Whatever lived out there had taught him more than he realized. And even if it was gone now, that didn't mean the lesson left with it. That night he left the lantern burning low and the door unlocked, just in case something passed through, just in case silence wanted to speak again. And in the farthest corner of the porch, where frost clung hardest, the broken arrow remained, untouched, not forgotten, just honored. It was spring again, the kind that didn't come in a rush, but like a soft knock at the edge of winter's door. Ice retreated in silence, leaving behind the shimmer of wet bark and the slow sigh of thawing moss. Rivers rose with memory. The wind carried warmth laced with cedar and the sweet rot of melting snow. Porter knew the rhythm by now, the way the woods loosened their grip, the way silence changed pitch just before green returned. He stood at the same bluff where the ridge overlooked the bends of the Pandore, where bare trees reached their fingers toward a sky that looked pale with forgiveness. He didn't come for work anymore. The trail reports, the repair tags, the official duties had fallen behind him like old bark. He came because he still heard the forest call his name, not with words, but with space made just for him. That morning he'd slipped the energy bar into his pocket like he always did this time of year. Not as food, as offering, the same kind he'd left before. Same brand, same crumpled edges. Only difference now was he didn't expect anything in return. It had been months since the last stone, since the broken arrow, since the night the silence deepened like water and never quite filled back up. But the forest hadn't turned its back. It had simply pulled back behind a veil he wasn't meant to lift. And still, he came. Still, he waited. He stepped carefully along the bend where the old lightning-split cedar leaned like a wounded guard, then found his way to the familiar log just before the river dipped east. The moss had grown back since last time. The bark was darker, but the shape of it hadn't changed. He placed the bar down slow, hand lingering over the wood, thumb brushing the groove where he once found the folded wrapper laid like a prayer. Then he sat, No flashlight, no pack. Just him and the river and the rhythm of branches clacking in the breeze. He didn't check behind him, didn't look for signs. There was no reason to chase what wasn't meant to be caught. Time had stretched since that last message. Since the snapped stone on the porch. Since the night he left the door unlocked and the wind pushed it open like a friend who didn't stay long. But the feeling, that deep, steady knowing that he'd once touched something sacred, never left. He pulled his coat tighter and leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes locked on the water. It was higher than last spring, the runoff more violent. The edges of the river curled white against the rocks, breaking apart the calm just enough to make it feel alive. He remembered what it was like the first time. That low sound rising from the dark, that massive form slumped in the hollow. Those eyes that held pain and memory in equal weight. He remembered his own fear, and how it melted the moment he chose to stay. He stayed a long time that morning. Long enough for the sun to climb just past the ridge. Long enough for the wind to change direction. Long enough for the warmth to start softening the soles of his boots. And then he stood. No sound followed. No branch snapped. No shape stirred in the trees. And that was okay. He turned back up the trail, moving slow, heart heavier than he meant for it to be. It wasn't sadness. Not quite. It was more like a low hum beneath the ribs, like part of him had opened too wide once and never fully closed. He was almost to the fork in the path when something shifted. It wasn't loud, wasn't obvious, just a difference in the light, a flicker against the moss. He paused, turned. There, just off the path, where the root of a fir tree met the edge of stone, something caught his eye, small, white. He stepped closer, breath held without meaning to, and knelt. A stone arrow, tiny, so small he might have missed it if the sun hadn't caught its edge. It wasn't like the others, not shaped with bold hands, not laid in a clear direction. It was pressed lightly into the moss, its tip barely breaching the surface, as if placed by fingers unsure they should still speak. But it was real. The stones were smooth, curved from river polish. The center rock had a faint red streak, like iron. It pointed not north, not east, but deeper, into a part of the forest untouched by old paths. He crouched there a long time, hands on his knees, eyes fixed on the arrow like it might breathe. No sound came from the trees, not even the birds, but something settled in his chest. Not excitement, not fear, recognition. He didn't follow it. Not that day. Not yet. He stood slowly, touched 2 fingers to his temple, then to the stone, then turned back toward the cabin. The walk home felt different. Like the forest stepped aside for him now. Like it remembered who he was and didn't need him to prove anything. He reached the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. The porch groaned beneath his boots. Same as always. The broken arrow was gone. The steps swept clean by wind or time. He opened the door and stepped inside. That night, the fire burned low and steady. He sat beside it, cup of tea in his hands, watching the glow rise and fall against the wood stove door. He didn't think about the creature. Not exactly. He thought about what it meant to be seen, to be acknowledged by something you couldn't name, but trusted anyway. He thought about how many years he'd spent trying to outrun loneliness by calling it independence, and how quickly that excuse fell apart when something big and hurting looked at him and didn't turn away. Before bed, he stepped outside once more. The wind had settled. The trees swayed slow. He stared into the dark, not expecting anything. But the memory of that arrow sat behind his ribs like warmth that didn't need flame. And far off in the trees, where the shadows folded into each other like fingers in prayer, something waited. Not close, not gone, but present in the way mountains are present, even when you can't see them. The night didn't end with a sound. It ended with a breath, and a single thought rising clear through the stillness. The story wasn't over. Not yet. It was late summer in Medellin Falls. The kind that didn't blaze but smoldered gently. Days long and golden, nights cool enough to open the windows again. Dust rose soft off the road when the breeze passed, and cottonwood seeds floated like lazy snow. The river had calmed. The forest had thickened. And Porter Hale, now 61, stood where the old trees split along the bluff, holding the same worn pack he'd carried most of his life. His hair had gone silver at the temples. His hands were calloused but slower. He didn't walk as far these days. But when the air turned like this, something in him always returned to that path. He hadn't spoken of it in years. Not to the new ranger who'd replaced him. Not to Lorraine, who still ran Mill Corner Diner with a smile that could disarm a blizzard. Not to anyone. The story had dried in his throat long ago, not from fear of being doubted, but from the knowledge that putting it into words would only shrink what it had been, what it still was. Some truths belonged only to the soil and the lungs of those who breathed them in. The forest greeted him the same way it always had. No grand welcome, no signs, just a stillness that shifted slightly, like a room holding its breath when an old friend crosses the threshold. He followed the trail past the cedar that had split clean during the ice storm of '97, past the hollow where the ash tree grew sideways, curled like a question. The air smelled of warm pine and dry grass. The light filtered in golden shafts that flickered between branches like old film. He didn't hurry. He knew the way by muscle memory. Each step laid down years ago, now worn smooth by time. When he reached the log, the one weathered gray and half swallowed by moss, he stopped. Knees popped when he crouched. He smiled a little at that. A real, quiet smile that only came when the noise of the world had finally let go. From the side pocket of his pack, he pulled out a familiar bar. Same brand, same flavor. The wrapper had faded from years in the drawer, but the shape held. He set it down gently on the log, same place as always. Didn't say a word. Just looked out toward the river, where light danced on the surface like the woods were blinking slowly. He sat there for a long while. No movement in the trees, no rustling, but something in the air wrapped around him, like memory too heavy to name. He didn't expect anything now. He didn't need proof. He wasn't chasing a sign. He just came because he said he would. Because he knew, even after all these years, the promise hadn't been about seeing them again. It had been about not forgetting. When the sun dipped just far enough for the shadows to stretch long across the clearing, he stood to leave. He adjusted his pack slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. His hand lingered once more on the log, fingertips trailing the moss like reading braille from a life already lived. He turned without ceremony, took 3 steps, stopped, looked back. The bar was gone. The log was bare, undisturbed, no sound, no breeze, just absence. But then, just beyond the lip of the stone where his boot had disturbed the moss, something caught his eye. He crouched again, heart suddenly brittle in his chest. Nestled in the green, small as a thumb, was a single pebble, white, flat. And next to it, barely touching, a smaller one, darker, shaped almost to a point. Together they formed an arrow, not straight, not bold, gentle, as if placed by fingers unsure if they were still allowed to speak. He didn't move it, didn't touch it, didn't need to. His breath caught in the back of his throat. Not from fear, but from something else. Something like awe. He sat back down, knees aching, and just stared at it. The forest didn't move, but the moment did. A shift so soft it felt like standing in the middle of a held breath. Like the woods had whispered back after all this time, not with voice, but with presence. Still here, still remembering, he stayed until the first chill brushed the back of his neck, the kind that reminded you daylight had limits. When he finally rose, he left the arrow where it was, left the bar in his pack this time, left the silence intact. Walking back through the trees, the world felt stretched, slow, like he was moving through honey. Each rustle of leaves overhead carried an echo of steps he'd taken long ago. He passed the same trees, the same roots, but everything felt older now. Not weaker, just fuller, as if the ground itself had absorbed his footsteps and remembered every one. Back at the cabin, dust swirled in the fading light as he stepped inside. It hadn't changed much. The same stovepipe in the corner, the same hand-cut shelves, a different chair now, one with a cushion that gave more than it pushed. He placed the pack on its hook and eased down slowly, knees creaking again. In the quiet, he could still hear the river from far off, muffled by pine and wind. A sound he hadn't realized he missed until now. On the table near the window sat the old compass. Still broken, still clean. He picked it up, turned it in his palm. The cedar needle was long gone, but the base still held the carved ring where it used to spin. A direction no longer needed. He placed it back, next to the folded wrapper he kept in the drawer beneath it. He lit a single candle, watched the flame dance, and in the flicker, in the hush that settled around his bones, a smile returned. The kind that didn't chase anything, just received. He whispered, not loud, not urgent, just enough to let it hang in the air. Some things you don't say out loud, not because they're secrets, but because they belong to the silence. Outside, the trees swayed softly. Inside, the candle guttered and held. And somewhere deep in the woods, past memory, past trail, past the reach of men, a figure turned in the dark and paused. Not because it heard, but because it knew. Porter Hale had kept his word, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes the most powerful connections we form in this life aren't spoken. They aren't captured in photographs or explained in neat lines of logic. They're felt deep in the quiet places of the soul, where trust lives without needing a name, where kindness, once offered with no expectation, circles back in ways we never imagined. There are moments that come only once, a breath in the forest, a glance between beings, a gesture left behind in the moss or snow. Moments too delicate for language. And when they pass, they don't disappear. They live on in the way we walk softer, listen longer, give more freely. Because when compassion meets silence, something sacred rises. Not in noise, not in proof, but in presence. In returning year after year to a place that remembers us just as we are. In keeping a promise, even if no one is watching. In believing that even the smallest acts, an outstretched hand, a shared shelter, a breadcrumb of trust, can echo louder than fear. Life isn't always about understanding everything. Sometimes it's about standing still when your instinct is to run, about showing mercy, even when you're uncertain, and about choosing to believe that not all things wild are meant to be feared, and not all things human are meant to harm. We live in a world that rushes to define, to explain, to capture. But there is beauty in the unspoken, strength in restraint, and healing in the quiet reciprocity between two beings who expect nothing from each other, yet choose to give anyway. That's where grace lives, in the spaces we don't always see, but feel. So maybe, when we leave something good behind, when we offer warmth in a cold world, when we choose gentleness over dominance, something remembers, not out of obligation, but out of honor. Not for reward, but because it matters. Thank you for being here, for walking this story to the end with us. If it stirred something in you, if it made you feel a little less alone, or reminded you of the good that still exists in quiet corners, we'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if this story resonated with you, we invite you to like, subscribe, and stay connected. There are more stories waiting, some whispered through trees, others still unfolding in the hearts of those who choose to believe. Until next time, may you move gently, listen deeply, and leave kindness in your wake.